Welcome back to Lafayette Returns, an historic Rockford podcast released monthly, leading up to Lafayette Day at Rockford, Monday, July 28th, 2025. I'm your host, Lisa Landis-Blowers. Today we are catching up with Public Historian Elizabeth Reese. She is an historian in the Washington, D.C. area. Elizabeth has spent over a decade as an interpreter at historic sites on the East Coast, and her work has also appeared in Time, the New York Times, and C-SPAN. She is currently the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Interpretation at Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House and is completing her Master of Arts in American History from Gettysburg College. Her new book, Marquis de Lafayette Returns, traces Lafayette's route throughout the National Capital Region. Elizabeth, we are so glad you could take time out of your very busy schedule to join us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm so excited to be here myself.
Your new book focuses on Lafayette's tour, his 1824-25 tour of the United States, and specifically a certain region, the National Capital Region. What inspired you to explore this part of his life?
So I have always been interested in the American Revolution, and especially kind of that antebellum period between the Revolution and the Civil War and kind of what's happening in the country at that time. Lafayette has kind of been, I often say he's kind of a ghost that's been kind of following me throughout my career. I've always been interested in him. He stands out among his peers as usually younger than many of his peers. He was French, and he has this really gregarious personality. I like to refer to him very lovingly as America's Golden Retriever, because he just has this bounding, excited energy about him that's really, really refreshing. My first job was at Hamilton Grange National Memorial in Harlem, which is Alexander Hamilton's house. And there was a Hamilton-Lafayette connection. Lafayette never visited the Grange when Hamilton was there, but their friendship and correspondence I was able to look into at my time there. I then worked at the United States Capitol building, which had a huge part of Lafayette's tour. And I was also working there during the peak of Hamilton musical. So Lafayette was a name that the public tended to know and wanted to hear about. And my current position is at Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House, just down the road from George Washington's Mount Vernon. It was the home of Nellie Parke Custis Lewis, one of George Washington's step-granddaughters. And Lafayette also visited there on his tour. So he's kind of been following me around. And when I first started looking into the tour, I noticed that there hadn't been a more current book about it. There have been published primary source accounts of newspapers and journal entries and things like that, which were very, very helpful in my own research, but no kind of account of what it looks like for current historians to kind of look back and see what his tour was about. It was before the bicentennial, which we're celebrating right now. So that was very helpful when it came to looking for publishers, because they were very interested in that it was timely. I've always really liked Lafayette, and then kind of the pieces have really fallen together with his tour and the bicentennial especially.
Yeah, perfect timing. It's so exciting that this is happening, and we can't wait for him to finally get to Lancaster in July. Thank goodness he extended the 3-month tour to 13 months, or he never would have visited here. So as you were doing your research, was there anything that was really surprising about his tour that you uncovered, or maybe something that we don't know, some of the lesser known parts of his tour?
Yeah, one thing that immediately comes to mind is that Lafayette's tour is one of the first documented cases of tourism in the United States. During this time, travel is really, really limited. You're traveling by foot, you're traveling by carriage, by horseback, or we have this newfangled thing called the steamboat if you're near water, but that's about it. And so most Americans aren't traveling outside of the county in which they're born in. But what we see a lot with Lafayette's tour, when crowd size was recorded, and it's not always recorded at every single visit, but the number of people who showed up to see Lafayette frequently outnumbered the recorded population at the time, or it came very close to reaching that population number, which indicates that there are people who are traveling outside of their homes with the hopes of seeing him. In the winter of 1824 into 1825, Lafayette kind of stays put in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the reasons I focused the book on the D.C. area is because he spends about a third of the tour in that region, which I kind of generously sort of define, but definitely the majority of his tour in that time period. And what happens is that like temporary rooming, like in boarding houses and taverns, they reached maximum capacity and an otherwise pretty quiet time in DC, which is indicating that, again, people are traveling with the hopes of seeing him. And there's no guarantee that they're going to see Lafayette at dinner or out at the theater, but just knowing where he was, people were willing to make the journey to see him, I think really speaks to what he meant to Americans in this time.
He was a rock star.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was interviewing somebody for this podcast, and they said, I would compare it to the Taylor Swift Eras tour. Everybody was talking about it.
I've heard that more than once. It's something that I will often say in programs, because not only is there this like nationwide phenomenon of people tracking him in every major newspaper. There was like a Lafayette section that people could read where he was, what he was doing, but you could also buy merchandise, souvenirs, like skyrocketed during this time period. Even after when he left, people wanted stuff with Lafayette's face on it. And what's really interesting about the souvenirs is that thousands of them still remain in very good condition, which indicates that they were passed down. Like to keep a piece that long in a family line or to donate it or whatever indicates a care for that object. And then also there's no like one kind of geared age group or kind of gender. There were pieces for everyone. You could get Lafayette ladies' gloves. You could get Lafayette smoking pipes. You could get pottery and anything you wanted with Lafayette's on it, you could get.
So why do you think that this is still such a big event today? It's a big deal. And why do you think it still remains such a significant event in American history?
I think there are a lot of parallels to 1824 America and America in 2024, 2025. And I think, especially when it comes to kind of the state of the nation, Lafayette was returning at a time of great political division. The War of 1812 kind of had wrapped up about 10 years before. And what comes out of the war is this sense of American identity. Americans start referring to themselves as Americans instead of just a Pennsylvanian or a Virginian or a Marylander. People see themselves as Americans, but people aren't really agreeing on what it means to be American. And so President Monroe invites Lafayette back to the United States to kind of bring people together because the country was about to be celebrating its 50th birthday. And so they wanted to get people excited to throw a party. And he's kind of wanting to ignore this political tension that's happening. And the political tension is definitely mounting during this time period, but Lafayette's arrival is definitely, the newspapers call it a balm for the electoral zeal that enveloped the nation. Because not only was he arriving at this monumental birthday, which we are about to be celebrating the semi-quincentennial, he was also arriving during a very contentious presidential election, the election of 1824. And Lafayette had this really kind of magic ability to bring people together in a way that I don't think has really been replicated ever since. Part of the reason why is because his connection to America was really that of really selfless service at the age of 19, coming here, funding his own way, volunteering his services and his money and his kind of status as a French noble, one of the wealthiest men in France, to help get France's aid to win the war. People were really drawn to that. He also didn't belong to a single American political party, and American politics in the early 19th century was really bitterly divided. And so Americans weren't seeing him as kind of a member of the Federalist Party or a member of the Democratic Republican Party. They really saw him as one of their own. I like to say also that he was equally good friends with Thomas Jefferson as he was with Alexander Hamilton. And I think he is probably the only person in existence who can really say that. And then I think today we kind of feel these similar tensions. We feel these similar kind of moment in American history and perhaps notice that there isn't really a Lafayette-like figure these days. So I think there's a lot to learn from how he approached the tour, through his personality, he had very impassioned views on civil rights, and especially in regards to the eradication of slavery. And I think there's a lot that we can still learn from him, even though he's no longer here.
America's first abolitionist? would we call him? One of
Yeah,
the first, I guess.
yeah, really, I generally say he has really strong anti-slavery views. One of the, I guess one of the key differences, I generally tend to see it is that like abolitionists are like the immediate end of slavery, and anti-slavery wants to end slavery. There's maybe gradual emancipation, and he is on the record saying that he has plans for gradual emancipation. He writes to George Washington about this in the 1780s. Says like, I have this amazing plan how we can end slavery in the United States, and Washington writes back, I'll talk about it more when I see you next, being very careful not to put his kind of words into writing. But when Washington decides to emancipate the people that he enslaved in his will, many people believe that Lafayette had an influence in him making that decision. So
any stories that you could share about Lafayette's interactions with local communities, maybe still stories and things that are remembered today, maybe even in the region around where you live?
yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we see in terms of how Lafayette is still remembered today that came out of the tour was through namesakes. I'm sure most towns have a street that he came through, have a street that's either Lafayette or Fayette. Many of these places are named after the tour. Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, the founders heard him speak, raced back and said, we got to name the school after him. Lafayette never went there, but they were so wrapped up in this kind of Lafayette fever. And what I tend to find is that when I speak to groups, that a lot of people say like, oh, I grew up on a Lafayette Street. I went to a Lafayette school, and I always like know the name, but I didn't know that much about him. And I think that celebrating this bicentennial is having an opportunity for people to maybe look beyond of, oh, I know the name. I can find out more about this guy. Why was this street named after him? There's also children named after him, which I don't think is as like prevalent in our society today as it may have been in the early 19th century.
Well, Elizabeth, if a fire truck goes by, it most likely is from the Lafayette Fire Company, which is about a quarter of a mile from my house. So,
I love
yes,
that.
and that is near Lafayette Tower Park, which there was a big gathering, and we're going to celebrate that in July. But you're right, Lafayette everywhere. Any misconceptions about the tour that you hope to dispel through your work?
That's a really good question. I think that I would hope that people want to learn more about him and actually like learn why he was important, not just in his service in the American Revolution, which is the reason why he comes back, is to kind of be celebrated as this hero of the revolution, but understand why we really celebrate this Franco-American alliance as well, as it was celebrated with the victory at Yorktown. It was celebrated all throughout Lafayette's tour, and why he is a person whose name we know. Perhaps a misconception is that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he can wrap guns and ships. Yeah,
we'll see.
We'll see.
Could you talk more about in what ways his tour contributed to shaping the national identity back then? And when he left, did he leave his mark? Talk more about that.
Absolutely. A huge presence in Lafayette's tour was the involvement of youth. Lafayette, again, he was 19 years old when he first comes here. He's the youngest major general in the Continental Army. And so when he comes back 40 years later, he is the last surviving major general of the American Revolution, and he's a lot of young people's only interaction with kind of these celebrated heroes of the war. So there is using youth throughout his tour. There were a lot of like children's groups who would recite poems and like throw flowers at his feet and kind of really be honored in these ceremonies, left an impact on these children who then pass it on to their children. And so he is really seen as this last ember of the revolution. There's still veterans that are still very much alive, but kind of in terms of the celebrity that Lafayette had, he kind of stands alone in that. And so he helps pass on those memories to the next generation. Equating it to now, we see how many World War II veterans are no longer with us, and kind of what that means as a generation dies out, what happens to these memories, what happens to people's general knowledge of their service and what they fought for. That is something that was very much happening in America in 1824, and Lafayette helps to bring about kind of more of like a contextual understanding of the war, which then gets passed down through other generations.
You're giving a lecture. Marquis de Lafayette returns Sunday, May 18th, 2 o'clock at Historic Rockford. Tickets at historicrockford.org. Can you talk more about what you're planning for that day? What can we expect?
Course. Yeah, there will be a brief kind of background on Lafayette himself. I find that he is not really a figure that you can dive right in. People don't generally know about his life in the same way we know about Washington and Jefferson. So if you aren't super versed in Lafayette's background, don't worry. We'll have some contextual information, especially what he was doing with his life between the end of the American Revolution and coming back in 1824. We'll talk about the state of the United States in 1824, kind of what's happening on our side of the ocean that brings Lafayette to us. We'll talk about just the larger impact of his tour, like what it meant when he arrived, what was the general reception, how did people respond, what was said about him, and then we'll talk about his visit to Lancaster and kind of what it meant to the region, what he visited, what he did, and kind of a local impact before ending on kind of the Lafayette's legacy and how he's remembered today because of the tour and kind of the lasting impact that he had. So a bit more in depth with what we've been talking about in this conversation.
Much
so
more.
I hope this teaser is enough for everyone.
Again, for tickets, historicrockford.org. I do know that your book is available in the Rockford gift shop. Where else can we find your book and more information on Elizabeth Reese, the public historian?
You can find my book pretty much wherever books are sold. You can also go to my website, which is elizabethmreese.com, and it has other kind of media, podcast appearances, lectures, and things like that that I've talked about, as well as where to find my book, where to order it if you're interested in that, and other stuff that I'm working on and researching as well.
Wonderful. Before we go, I would love to have you share some details on your work at Woodlawn and the Pope-Leighey House. I know you would love to have everybody come and visit you.
I would love for everyone to come and visit. Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House is just 3 miles away from George Washington's Mount Vernon. So if you're planning trips to the DC area this summer and you're looking to visit Mount Vernon, I encourage you to make the quick 10-minute drive down the road to visit us. We're a pretty unique spot. We are 2 historic house museums. Woodlawn is the former plantation site. It's the original big house. It was owned by Nellie Park Custis Lewis and her husband Lawrence Lewis, and it was originally part of Mount Vernon. It was one of the 5 farms of Mount Vernon, and after their marriage, Washington gifted them the westernmost farm. And we also have on the site the Pope-Leighey House, which is the only Frank Lloyd Wright house open to the public in the DC area that was moved to the property in the 1960s. So you really get a full taste of American architecture. You get that federal Georgian, William Thornton designed plantation house, and then you get a much smaller Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian home. You may not think these 2 houses go well together, but they have quite a lot to say about kind of how Americans live and everything in between. So I would highly encourage, if you've never been, to come stop by for a visit. You can go to woodlawnpopeleighey.org or search Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House, and all our information's there. We're open Thursdays through Mondays, and we would love to see you on a tour.
Elizabeth, thank you so much, and we will see you in May.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm looking forward to it.
Tune in next month for a brand new episode as we prepare for Lafayette's visit. For more information on Rockford's Lafayette Day, visit historicrockford.org/special-events. For information on what's happening across Lancaster and Western Chester counties, go to Lafayette200pa.org. I'm Lisa Landis Flowers. Thank you so much for listening.